Picture this: a quiet Memorial Day weekend in a small American town. An elderly veteran sits peacefully at a local diner, wearing his service cap with pride. Suddenly, a leather-clad biker storms over, snatches that sacred cap right off his head, and throws it to the ground like it's worthless trash. The entire diner falls silent. But here's what that arrogant biker didn't know. Exactly 30 minutes later, a Black Hawk helicopter would descend from the sky and land right in the middle of Main Street. And what happened next would leave that biker questioning every decision he'd ever made in his life. Stay with me, because this story will absolutely blow your mind. Welcome to Honor Echoes, where we share the most incredible stories of courage, respect, and justice involving our nation's heroes. I'm here to tell you stories that will restore your faith in humanity and remind you why we must never forget those who served. If you're ready to hear tales that will give you chills and make you believe in karma, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear is just the beginning. Let me take you back to Millbrook, Tennessee, population 4,800. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the local diner serves the best apple pie for 3 counties, and where Memorial Day weekend means something sacred. The town square has a monument that lists every local boy who never came home, and the annual parade draws folks from neighboring counties who come to pay their respects. It was a Saturday afternoon, around 2 o'clock, when I witnessed something that would change this quiet town forever. I was sitting in Murphy's Diner, the same red vinyl booths that had been there since 1962, nursing my 3rd cup of coffee and working on my laptop. The lunch rush had died down, leaving maybe a dozen people scattered across the restaurant. That's when Samuel Morrison walked in. Now, Samuel wasn't just any customer. At 78 years old, he was Millbrook royalty. Not because of money or fame, but because of respect. Samuel was a Vietnam veteran who'd done 3 tours, earned 2 Purple Hearts, and came home to work at the county courthouse for 42 years. Every Tuesday and Saturday, like clockwork, he'd come to Murphy's for his usual black coffee, grilled cheese sandwich, and a slice of that famous apple pie. But what made Samuel special wasn't just his service record, it was how he carried himself. Despite the shrapnel scars on his left arm and the limp he'd carried since 1969, Samuel walked with dignity. He wore his Vietnam veteran's cap with quiet pride, never boasting, never seeking attention. Just a gentle reminder of service to country. Samuel took his usual booth by the window, the one that gave him a clear view of the street. Old habits from the war, I suppose. He ordered his usual from Jenny, the waitress who'd been serving him for 15 years, and settled in with the local newspaper. That's when the rumble started. At first it was just a distant growl, like thunder on a clear day. But it grew louder, deeper, until the coffee cups on the tables started vibrating. Through the window, we could see them coming down Main Street like a steel cavalry, 8 motorcycles, chrome gleaming, engines roaring with intentional aggression. The Hellion. That's what they called themselves. A motorcycle club that had been causing trouble across 3 counties for the past year. Not your typical weekend riders or charity bikers. These were the real deal leather vests, with patches that told stories of bar fights and run-ins with the law. Their leader was a man they called Tank, 6 feet 4 inches of pure arrogance wrapped in black leather and bad intentions. The bikes pulled up right in front of Murphy's Diner, engines revving unnecessarily loud, like they were announcing their arrival to the world. Through the window, I could see Tank dismounting his machine, a massive Harley-Davidson that probably cost more than most people make in a year. He was the kind of man who demanded attention wherever he went, and usually got it through intimidation. The bell above the diner door chimed as Tank pushed inside, followed by 3 of his crew. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even little Bobby Henderson, who'd been chattering away about his baseball game, fell silent when he saw these men. Tank stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the room like a predator surveying its territory. His eyes swept past families with children, past elderly couples, past working folks just trying to enjoy their weekend meal. And then his gaze settled on Samuel Morrison, sitting quietly in his booth, reading his newspaper. I don't know what triggered Tank's attention. Maybe it was the military bearing that Samuel couldn't shake even after 50 years. Maybe it was the Vietnam veteran's cap that sat proudly on the table beside his coffee cup. Or maybe Tank was just the kind of man who couldn't stand seeing someone at peace when he was carrying so much anger. Tank walked over to Samuel's booth with the swagger of a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. His boots hit the checkered linoleum floor with intentional force, each step designed to announce his presence. The diner had gone completely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their prep work to watch what was unfolding. Well, 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 Tank said, his voice carrying across the quiet restaurant. What do we have here? Old-timer playing soldier. Samuel looked up from his newspaper, his weathered face calm but alert. Those who knew him could see the subtle shift in his posture, not aggressive, but ready. It was the bearing of a man who'd faced real danger and survived. Good afternoon, Samuel said simply, his voice steady and polite. Can I help you with something? Tank leaned against the table, his massive frame casting a shadow over the elderly veteran. That's a fancy hat you got there, Pops. You actually earned that, or you just like playing dress-up? The insult hung in the air like smoke. Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained controlled. I served 3 tours in Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry Division. This cap represents my service to this country. Vietnam. Tank laughed, a harsh sound that made several diners flinch. That was like 50 years ago, old man. Ancient history. Time to put away the toys and join the real world. What happened next occurred so fast that it took a moment for my brain to process it. Tank reached across the table, snatched Samuel's Vietnam veteran's cap right off the table. And before anyone could react, he threw it onto the floor of the diner. The cap landed beside the booth, the American flag patch face down on the dirty linoleum. The silence that followed was deafening. I'd never experienced anything like it. It was as if the entire diner had collectively held its breath. Children sensed the tension and moved closer to their parents. Elderly couples who'd probably never raised their voices in 50 years of marriage looked on in shock. Even Tank's own crew seemed surprised by the brazenness of the act. Samuel stared at his cap on the floor for what felt like an eternity. When he looked up at Tank, there was something in his eyes that I recognized. Not anger, not fear, but the cold assessment of a man who'd seen combat. It was the look of someone calculating odds and possibilities. Son, Samuel said quietly, I'm going to give you one chance to pick that up and apologize. Tank threw back his head and laughed. Or what, Grandpa, you gonna call the cops? Fight me? He gestured to his crew. In case you haven't noticed, you're outnumbered and outgunned. Samuel slowly stood up from his booth. Despite being several inches shorter than Tank and probably 60 pounds lighter, there was something about the way he moved that commanded attention. I've faced down men with AK-47s who were trying to kill me. I'm not intimidated by a bully in a motorcycle jacket. Is that so? Tank stepped closer, invading Samuel's personal space. Well, maybe it's time someone taught you some respect for your betters. That's when Jenny, the waitress, stepped forward. Sweet Jenny, who'd been serving coffee and kindness to this community for 30 years, positioned herself between Tank and Samuel. That's enough, she said, her voice shaking but determined. You need to leave now. Tank looked at her with amusement. Stay out of this, waitress. This is between me and the toy soldier here. But Jenny had opened the floodgates. Old Frank Patterson, who'd fought in Korea, stood up from his table. You heard her. Leave the man alone and get out. Tank's crew started to move, hands drifting toward whatever weapons they might be carrying. The situation was escalating fast, and I could see it spinning toward violence. That's when Samuel held up his hand. It's all right, folks, he said calmly. No need for anyone else to get involved. He looked directly at Tank. You want to disrespect my service and my country? That's your choice, but you'll have to live with the consequences. Tank smirked. What consequences? What's an old man like you gonna do? Samuel bent down slowly, his old knees creaking, and picked up his cap. He brushed off the dust and placed it back on his head. I'm not going to do anything, he said. But someone else might. Yeah, like who? Samuel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old flip phone. Without breaking eye contact with Tank, he dialed a number and waited. When someone answered, he spoke just 4 words. Charlie Mike is compromised. Tank laughed. Ooh, scary. You calling your nursing home to come pick you up? Samuel closed the phone and sat back down in his booth. He picked up his newspaper and continued reading as if nothing had happened. You have approximately 30 minutes to decide if you want to be here when they arrive. When who arrives? Tank demanded. Samuel just smiled and turned the page of his newspaper. Tank and his crew exchanged glances. They'd expected the old man to back down, to grovel, maybe even to fight back so they could justify beating him up. They hadn't expected this calm confidence, this mysterious phone call, this talk of consequences. You're bluffing, Tank said. But there was less certainty in his voice now. Samuel didn't respond. He just continued reading his paper, occasionally sipping his coffee like he didn't have a care in the world. For the next few minutes, Tank and his crew milled around the diner, making crude comments and trying to provoke another reaction from Samuel. But the elderly veteran had retreated into that mental space that combat soldiers know well, alert but detached, ready but patient. I found myself checking my watch obsessively. 10 minutes passed, 15, 20. Tank was getting restless, his bravado starting to fade as Samuel's calm confidence began to unnerve him. This is stupid, one of Tank's crew muttered. Let's just go. Shut up, Tank snapped. I'm not getting run off by some old fool's bluff. 25 minutes. That's when we heard it again. But this time, it wasn't the rumble of motorcycle engines. It was something else entirely, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The coffee cup started vibrating again, but this vibration was different, deeper, more powerful. The sound grew louder, and suddenly everyone in the diner rushed to the windows. There, coming in low over the tree line at the edge of town, was a Black Hawk helicopter in full military configuration. Tank's face went white. What the hell? The helicopter circled the town once, like it was surveying the area, then began its descent toward Main Street. I watched in absolute amazement as the pilot set that massive machine down right in the middle of the street, directly in front of Murphy's Diner. The rotor wash sent dust and debris swirling everywhere, and every car alarm within a 3-block radius started going off. Through the chaos, I could see figures moving inside the helicopter. As the rotors began to slow, the side door slid open, and 4 men in military fatigues stepped out. But these weren't just any soldiers. Even from inside the diner, I could see the bearing, the equipment, the confidence that marked them as special operations. The lead soldier, a man who looked to be in his 40s with steel gray eyes and the kind of presence that commands attention, walked directly toward the diner. His name tape read Colonel Martinez, and the insignia on his uniform indicated he was with the 75th Ranger Regiment. Tank tried to back toward the rear exit, but his legs seemed frozen. His crew looked like they were about to bolt, but they too seemed paralyzed by the surreal nature of what was happening. The colonel pushed through the diner door with the same confidence Tank had shown earlier, but where Tank's presence had been threatening, this man's was protective. He scanned the room quickly, professionally, until his eyes found Samuel Morrison sitting calmly in his booth. Charlie Mike, the colonel said, and his voice carried a warmth and respect that was unmistakable. Samuel looked up from his newspaper and smiled. Hello, son, thanks for coming. The colonel walked over to Samuel's booth and extended his hand. Samuel stood and shook it firmly, and I could see genuine affection between these 2 men. Sir, the colonel said, we got your signal. What's the situation? Samuel nodded toward Tank, who was now pressed against the wall looking like he'd seen a ghost. That gentleman there decided to disrespect the uniform and the flag. Thought you might want to have a conversation with him about what that means. The colonel turned to face Tank, and when he did, Tank actually tried to make himself smaller. It was remarkable to watch, this giant of a man who'd terrorized the diner just minutes before, was now cowering before a soldier who was probably 6 inches shorter. "You're the one who threw this man's cap on the ground?" the colonel asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Tank stammered something unintelligible. "I asked you a question, civilian. Did you or did you not show disrespect to this veteran service cap?" I didn't know, ... double quotes Tank managed. "Didn't know what that actions have consequences. That this man earned that cap in the jungles of Vietnam while you were probably in diapers." The colonel stepped closer. "Do you have any idea who you just disrespected?" Tank shook his head. The colonel turned back to Samuel. "Would you like to tell him, or should I?" Samuel waved his hand. "You go ahead, Roberto. You always were better at telling stories, Roberto." The colonel's name was Roberto Martinez, and clearly, he and Samuel had history. Colonel Martinez turned back to Tank. "This man, Samuel Morrison, saved my life in Afghanistan in 2003. I was a young lieutenant, fresh out of West Point, thought I knew everything about combat. We were pinned down by insurgents in Kandahar province, and I made a rookie mistake that would have gotten my entire squad killed." He gestured toward Samuel. "Mr. Morrison was there as a civilian contractor, using his Vietnam experience to help train Afghan forces. When he saw what was happening, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed an M4 and led a flanking maneuver that saved 12 American lives, including mine." Tank's mouth fell open. "That's not all," the colonel continued. "After that mission, I started researching Mr. Morrison's service record. Do you know what I found? 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star with V for Valor, a Distinguished Service Cross. This man was decorated for single-handedly holding a firebase against a Viet Cong assault for 6 hours while waiting for reinforcement." The diner was absolutely silent except for the colonel's voice. "But here's what really impressed me," Martinez continued. "After Vietnam, he came home and never talked about his service. Never bragged, never sought recognition. He just quietly served his community for 42 years, helping veterans navigate the VA system, organizing support groups, making sure no one got left behind." Samuel shifted uncomfortably. "Roberto, you don't need to." "Yes, sir, I do." The colonel's voice was firm. "Because this ignorant fool needs to understand what he just disrespected." He turned back to Tank. "When I made colonel, the first person I called was Mr. Morrison. When my daughter graduated from college, he was one of 5 people I invited to the ceremony. When my father died, he flew to Colorado at his own expense to stand honor guard at the funeral." Tank was now visibly sweating. "So when Charlie Mike, that's his call sign from Vietnam, sends out a distress signal, I don't care if I'm in the middle of a training exercise with NATO forces. I don't care if I have to commandeer a Black Hawk and fly 300 miles. I come running." Colonel Martinez stepped within inches of Tank's face. "Now, I'm going to give you exactly one opportunity to make this right. You're going to apologize to Mr. Morrison, with sincerity and respect. Then you're going to leave this town and never come back. And if I ever hear that you or any of your crew has disrespected another veteran anywhere in this country, I will find you. Do we understand each other?" Tank nodded frantically. "Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I understand." "Then do it." Tank walked over to Samuel's booth on shaking legs. "Sir, I am deeply sorry for what I did. I was wrong. I disrespected you in your service, and I have no excuse for my behavior." Samuel looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Apology accepted, son. But let this be a lesson to you. Every veteran you meet has paid a price for your freedom. Show them the respect they've earned." "Yes, sir, I will. I promise." Colonel Martinez gestured toward the door. "Now leave." Tank and his crew practically ran from the diner, their motorcycles starting with desperate urgency. Within minutes, the sound of their engines had faded into the distance, and they were gone. The colonel sat down across from Samuel in the booth. "How are you doing, Charlie Mike?" "Really?" Samuel smiled. "Better now. Thanks for coming, Roberto. I know you're busy." "Never too busy for you, sir. You know that. The colonel looked around the diner at all the people who were still staring in amazement. Besides, my team needed to practice rapid deployment scenarios. This was good training. They talked for another few minutes, catching up on family and mutual friends. The colonel's team remained outside with the helicopter, professional and courteous but clearly ready for anything. Finally, Colonel Martinez stood up. I need to get back to base, but you have my number. You call if you need anything at all. I will give my love to Maria and the kids. I will, and sir, thank you for everything, not just today, but for everything you've taught me about service and sacrifice. Samuel stood and shook his hand again. You don't need to thank me, son. You've become everything I knew you could be. Your country is lucky to have you. The colonel walked to the door, then turned back one more time. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, addressing the entire diner, you have a true American hero in your community. Don't ever take that for granted. And with that, he was gone. The Black Hawk lifted off as dramatically as it had arrived, banking toward the west and disappearing over the horizon. The silence that followed was very different from the tense quiet that had filled the diner earlier. This was the silence of awe, of people trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Samuel sat back down and picked up his newspaper again. But Jenny, the waitress, approached his table. Mr. Morrison, she said, her voice full of emotion. Your meal today is on the house. In fact, your meals are on the house for life. A round of applause started from the back of the diner and spread throughout the restaurant. Samuel looked embarrassed by the attention, but he accepted it with the same grace he'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. As for Tank and his crew, they kept their word. They never returned to Millbrook, and word spread quickly through the motorcycle community about what had happened. The story became legend, and it served as a powerful reminder that respect for veterans isn't just a nice gesture, it's a sacred obligation. That's the power of respect, friends. That's the power of understanding that freedom isn't free. And those who've served have earned our gratitude, not our indifference. Samuel Morrison represents thousands of quiet heroes in communities across America. Men and women who served with honor, came home, and continued serving in different ways. If this story moved you, if it reminded you why we must never forget our veterans, then I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to Honor Echoes right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And the next time you see a veteran, whether they're wearing a cap, a uniform, or just carrying themselves with that unmistakable bearing of someone who served, take a moment to say thank you. Their stories matter. Their service matters. And in a world that often forgets, we must be the ones who remember. Hit that subscribe button, and let's keep honoring the echoes of their courage together. Until next time, this is Honor Echoes, reminding you that heroes walk among us every day.